In a world where there's a billion of movies and albums and video games, that number increasing exponentially every single day, how are we, the consumers, supposed to know what's worth spending our valuable and limited time on? There's a bunch of ways that you could go about it. You could just pick things at random, just do what your friends are doing. You could sort by new on the Steam store. You could click on the music video with the cutest anime girl in the thumbnail. And honestly, all these methods, while they can be about as calculated as throwing a dart at a dartboard while you're blindfolded and in the wrong room, they work well enough for most people, especially if you aren't super hardcore about these things and just want to kill time or have fun. But for enthusiasts like you and me, I'm assuming that you're an enthusiast as you clicked on this video. We want to curate our experiences so that as much media we consume as possible is a memorable and fulfilling experience. This is where we turn to reviews and criticism. You can just get a bunch of people whose job it is to tell you how good a thing is and do all the nitty-gritty for you. But here's where things get stupid and complicated, because finding a review that you could trust isn't as easy as googling My Sims Racing DS review. No, that'd be too simple. You gotta do your research on who you could trust to do your research for you, which at this point you may wonder why even bother. Well, first of all, video games in particular are fucking expensive. Most people don't want to risk 90 maple bucks for a new game that they end up hating, so spending that time is often worth it. And on top of that, once you have a pool of reviewers that you can trust, or, you develop a reviewer's mindset for yourself and can sniff out a game's quality based on their store page alone, well, that's it, you're home free, the time investment's over, so it's well worth it in the long run. So, how do you find a reviewer that you can trust then? Well, in my opinion, it's better to stick to a few consistent people rather than just shoot blindly at a random review on the tube every time, because you can get a feel for what they personally value over time. And if they have the same values as you, you're gonna get more consistent and reliable opinions to steal and possibly act upon. Now, you don't actually have to agree with every little thing they say, nor should you. I personally love Video Game Donkey, but I never take his opinion of, say, Xenoblade Chronicles to heart.
Fucking stupid game.
Because I know that's not where his priorities are at. I'd probably prefer to go to someone like Some Call Me Johnny for JRPGs. Having a diverse palette of reviewers that you subscribe to will not only give you more covered ground, but will also help you get a more rounded understanding of how a game ticks, and you're probably going to be able to catch red flags or green flags more easily. Now, besides having opinions that align with mine, what actually makes for a good critic in the first place? Well, good criticism, obviously. Now, you may be wondering what good criticism is. After all, it is the subject of this video. But to answer that, we'll need to talk about what the purpose of criticism is. Well, pan and codec references aside, we've already answered half of this, helping consumers find good products, which in the realm of media and art involves a lot of subjectivity. Therefore, good criticism should be as specific and objective as possible. You can't go around blaming your own preferences and mistakes on the game itself, and just saying the gameplay is good doesn't really help anyone, especially in isolation. Now, if thousands of people are saying the gameplay is good with very little opposition, well, that's a bit more handy, but that's a tangent for later. Good, bad, weird, cringe, hard, immersive. These are all empty, meaningless words that add basically nothing when used on their own. They're nothing words, they basically don't fucking exist. You need to be more specific than that. Be as specific as possible. What exactly makes you feel this way? Break it down and make it as clear as possible what tiny nugget is the reason for your feelings. And for God's sake, try not to let your emotions get in the way. And especially don't just start throwing insults at the people who made the thing just because they have a different opinion than you. That helps no one, and in fact probably just creates a net negative impact on the world. That is a real-ass human being behind the thing that you're throwing slurs at, which is a passable segue into my next point of interest. The other major purpose of criticism, the creators. Feedback is a hugely important part of the creative process, especially if you're just starting out. If any of you have ever put a creative project out there, I'm sure you felt the frustration of, oh, let me know what you guys think. By making any unintentional shortcomings and issues clear, as well as any strong points, the creators can much more easily improve the current product, or at the very least, improve any future projects. Believe it or not, improvement is made a lot easier by knowing what you actually need to improve on. And this is the part of the video where I tell you guys to leave comments on my videos. Because I am a creator after all, and all of this applies to me. Any feedback that you guys give me now can potentially benefit you later. So go nuts! Meticulously lay out all of my flaws in front of me. I mean, hey, I'm a small creator. I promise I read every single comment and I take them all to heart. Now, just to recap everything we've gone over so far, a good review involves specific, in-depth criticism from a voice you can trust and agree with that makes any personal biases clear, while still remaining as objective as possible. So what would the exact opposite of that be? No consistent voice, vague criticisms that seem to target random and subjective talking points, and what the fuck is this supposed to be? How many days I have left to live? I have terminal cancer. This 10-point review system that's used so often is so atrocious for giving information that this entire video was actually inspired by and is secretly all about it and its better alternatives. First of all, why? Why is a point system useful in reviews and criticism in the first place? Very bluntly, it's just to summarize. Individual reviews and critics, if they've done their job properly, straight up, do not need this. They can choose to use them, it can wrap up a review with a nice pretty bow on top. I know for a fact that I can't judge much, I am horrible at conclusions. But if you're thorough, I believe it's better to just not use points, and let the reader or viewer or listener draw their own conclusions on the product, based on what they personally value. Speaking of values, seeing as a score should be relative to what the product's values are, comparing scores is kind of useless. Nobody is going to go to Metacritic and sort by high and then play each game going down the list. An example from one of my more recent videos, I rated Terraria a 4 out of 5, and The Beginner's Guide a 5 out of 5. Does that mean The Beginner's Guide is just better? If you have 20 bones to spend, should everyone choose The Beginner's Guide first? Hell no. I think for most people, Terraria is actually the better choice, despite also believing that it has more flaws, simply because The Beginner's Guide is being judged on completely different terms. This is the type of game where you boot it up once, and 90 minutes later you've experienced everything the game has to offer. You're probably never gonna return to it. Terraria, on the other hand, is something that you can play for years on end and not get bored, and it's just straight up more fun. All of this being said, a point system does have its uses. I mean, I just used them myself for Christ's sake, so let's go over why they can be useful, starting with the one that has me so heated. 10-point score systems are bad, simply put, because they're too vague and unclear. 10 whole points creates way too much wiggle room, which means that a 7 out of 10 is going to mean different things depending on who gave that 7 out of 10. Because nobody really has the exact same idea of what a 7 out of 10 means. Some say a 7 out of 10 means the game is straight up bad, while others say that it's a kinda okay and even good score. Couple this with the fact that the 10-point system is most commonly used on big publishing sites where you don't really know who's giving the score in the first place, and yeah, you can kinda see how this is inconsistent. Not to mention just how much wasted space there is at the bottom half of the scale. 0 to 5 is literally half the scale, and they all just mean that the thing is bad. Now, the scoring system can be improved by the usage of moods on top of the score, and it's easier to just show you what I mean than to try to explain it.
On the sheer quality of the games, I'd give it 9 tingles, but they're sad.
I'm feeling a strong 7 to a light 8 on this one. Transition.
So, the 10-point system lacks precision for individual reviewers, but what about sites like Metacritic or Steam, which average out lots of reviews? Well, a 10-point system kinda sucks for that too, because while there's basically no difference between a 3 and a 4, there is a big difference between an 8 and a 9, and rounding can make the average flip between the two pretty easily if it lies somewhere in the middle. The 10-point scoring system is just kind of in a no man's land of utility. Continuing with the concept of averaging lots of reviews, we have the 100-point system. It shares a lot of the same problems with the 10-point system, but unlike the 10-point system, there is actually some sort of utility in it. As I said before, there is a pretty clear difference between an 8 out of 10 and a 9 out of 10, and the same can be said about an 85 out of 100 and a 94 out of 100. In a 10-point system, those average scores would be rounded to the same 9 out of 10, which kinda hides the full truth of the score. Any more precise than a 100-point system isn't really necessary though, and honestly I've never seen a higher scoring system being used, since there's still effectively no difference between a 74 and a 75, so rounding there doesn't force you to lose any clarity. That being said, there are some issues with gathering an average score based on many, in that, statistically speaking, half of all people are stupider than average, and some people just don't put much critical thought into their reviews, and some people will just use their vote as an outlet for their emotions. So having a higher score can often mean that the game isn't necessarily good, but rather that it does very little to make people pissed off enough to leave a negative review in the first place. There's also the problem of review bombing, where a couple of pissed off people with super negative scores can greatly impact an otherwise highly praised title. A couple of these problems can be solved or lessened by doing things the way Steam does it, by only giving the community 2 options to choose from for their score, recommended or not recommended, rather than the full 10 or 100 point spectrum. This can help with the issue of different people having a different idea of what a 7 out of 10 means, people who put very little thought into their score, and review bombing, but it can also make the whole concept of high scores meaning inoffensive rather than good thing worse. Either way, a 100-point system is a good baseline for what the average person thinks of a game, but should still be taken alongside actual reviews that go into specific detail, either by using outside reviewers or, my preferred method, simply only reading the bad reviews to see what people are actually getting pissed off at on average and see if it's a thing that I personally value. And of course, if it wasn't already implied, for individual reviewers, the 100-point system is just worse than the 10-point system. So the logical next step here is that a 5-point system would be good for individual reviewers and not as good for mass reviews. And yeah, that's the short version of it. There's so little wiggle room with a 5-point system that you can't really have a disagreement on what a score means, with the possible exception of a 3 out of 5. This is my preferred method of scoring when I do choose to add scores, and this is kinda how I would describe each scoring for me personally. Now, some people will add half points on top of this, which you kinda gotta be careful with because if you do it for every fucking review, that's basically a 10-point system with extra steps. While the 5-point system does lack in precision, you don't actually really need precision for review scores because you should be leaving the precision to the actual meat of the reviews, which is the spoken part. Something that I find surprisingly related to the 5-point system is the ever-popular tier list. Obviously, tier lists are only useful for comparison purposes, and the more alike the things are, the more concise the information will be. On that note, ranking games or albums or movies all on the same tier list is kinda not useful, since the differences in what they're trying to accomplish can be pretty huge. But say that you rank all the games in one series, or all the albums of one artist or in a genre, and suddenly that's a pretty efficient way to deliver opinions. One thing I do want to mention here is that the individual tiers and the gaps between them matter a lot. Not every tier list should use all tiers. S tier should usually only contain a relatively small number of items that are truly untouchable. Just because an item happens to be in the top 3 of all the items doesn't necessarily mean that it deserves S tier, and that kind of applies to the other tiers as well. Putting the lowest ranked item in D tier as opposed to F tier still says something about that item, even if it's the worst regardless. In general, this is how each tier should be judged. All this being said, tier lists definitely serve a different purpose than the rest of the scoring systems that I've mentioned in this video, but they're probably the most fun to use and make, mostly because humans love their categories, for better or for worse. Alright, one last scoring system real quick before I wrap things up, and it is by far the filthiest one of them all. Close your eyes for a second and imagine with me, or wait, this is a video, I could just show you the scenario.
Oh boy, do I love video games. I'm going to look on the Steam store at a new game that I would like to purchase, and I'm going to check the reviews of this video game to see if it is worth my money.
These are bad, awful, stupid, and bad. And if you've been paying attention so far, you've probably already have a good idea as to why. First, let's go over the categories real quick. Graphics, gameplay, audio, audience, PC requirements, difficulty, grind, story, game time, price, bugs, and score out of 10. So in general, this format puts all of these things on equal ground. I'm sure that I don't have to explain to you how the entire umbrella of gameplay is not actually equal to something like how much grinding there is, which in most modern titles isn't even something that's present, and it doesn't really give any insight as to what the game values either. For example, Ori and the Will of the Wisps and Undertale both have fantastic stories. But if we took just the stories and compared them side to side, Undertale blows Ori out of the fucking water, because the story just isn't as inherently important to the overall experience. A lot of these categories are things that most reviewers won't even need to mention for most games anyways. It just wastes the reviewers and the reader's time to go over something like the soundtrack isn't super noteworthy for every single game under the sun. And then on the reverse side, for things that are generally important for every game, it's way too vague. It tells you absolutely nothing about why the gameplay is good, it just tells you that this particular person enjoyed it, which gives you very close to absolutely no information whatsoever. If you're shopping around for games and you know nothing about them, and reviews like this are all you're going off of, well, you could quite honestly throw 80% of this in the trash, because it tells you fucking nothing in isolation! Granted, yes, some of these things are important to know before purchasing, like average difficulty, and the price of the game, and the game length, and PC requirements. I think that these are all great things that you can put out there in a quick, non-elaborate fashion, but it shouldn't be competing for real estate against fucking gameplay! Not to mention, half of these things are already on the fucking store page anyways! They're entirely redundant. Okay, look, just to show you how awful all this is, if you aren't already convinced, I'm gonna go and make a video equivalent review of Undertale. The graphics are very simple. The gameplay is decent. The soundtrack is very good. Most audiences can enjoy this game. Pretty much any computer can run this game. It's not very hard, unless you go for the extra content. The story is really good. The game takes about 5 to 7 hours to get one ending. The game is very reasonably priced. Bugs are present, but shouldn't obstruct the average player. Now, wasn't that just fucking miserable? Now, keep in mind, I was actually giving you a little bit more information than these text monstrosities just by the virtue of working with video. And you still probably have no idea how I feel about this game overall. Now, using about the same amount of time that took, I'm gonna go and try to make a good version. Undertale is one of the most important games of this generation, and to not play it is an insult to gaming as a whole. It lures you in with a really robust intro and battle system, and then hits you with some of the most entertaining and interesting characters in fiction, with complex moral dilemmas unlike anything I've ever experienced before, all backed by a beautifully composed soundtrack chock full of emotion and leitmotifs. It's an RPG where your role and actions and choices can all be felt in the world, the characters, and, well, the player's own heart. Okay, so you see what I did there? I actually focused on what's important about the game, the stuff that you can't just get from the store page. I didn't need to talk about all that other stuff because it doesn't change the experience in a significant way, and there are never gonna be reasons to draw you in or push you away. Remember that the purpose of reviews in general is to show you what to expect and what specifically makes the thing good or bad. Being thorough is important, as it leads to more informed choices from the consumers and better future projects for the creators, as well as just being more entertaining to look at because comparing opinions can be really fun. Creative media is about everyone involved, the people who make it and the people who experience it, and good criticism is how the two parties communicate. So get out there and spend a few minutes telling the world precisely what they're doing right and wrong, without being an asshole about it, of course, and make the world a better place because of it. And in exchange, I offer to you, my dear viewers, more great content in the future. And to YouTube, my hosts, please bring back the 5-star rating system. Or for Christ's sake, at least the dislike button? I mean, come on, seriously, nobody wanted this. So literally, it just makes it harder for everyone to know what's going on. I'm in the group of people that this decision was supposedly made for, and I can tell you firsthand that it's more harmful than anything. Oh man.